distinct honor and privilege to introduce our first speaker, Natan Sznaider, who is a professor of sociology at the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo in Israel. His primary research interests are the sociology of the Holocaust and Genocide, cosmopolitanism, and human rights. Please join me in welcoming
Thank you for having me here. It's my first time in Minnesota, and I'm very, very happy to be here. There has been a lot of critique on the international human rights regime and the human rights movement that it is Euro-centered. And it definitely is Euro-centered. And I will show you today that it is not only Euro-centered, it is Eastern Euro-centered. And this is part of what I'm going to talk about today. Some people view the Holocaust as the culmination of the history of anti-Semitism. Some see it as the apogee of the history of racism, and some even consider it a crime against humanity. And the difference between these points of view are subtle but crucial. Anti-Semitism is suffered only by Jews. Racism, a broader category, can be experienced by anyone who is different or other. Crimes against humanity are broader still, and maybe even considered crimes against the human condition. The Holocaust, this term was not used until several years after the war, constitutes an epochal break with the past, regardless of the scope of the definition. It thus has the potential to challenge some basic assumptions about the sovereign law of nation-states, for example, and to create a cosmopolitanized public and political space that reinforces moral interdependencies. This emergent cosmopolitanism exemplifies a dynamic through which global concerns become part of local experiences. In this talk, I would like to show how these political and intellectual developments changed in the period between the world wars, and were first of all part of Jewish lived experience, an experience in which Jewish intellectuals like Hannah Arendt, like Raphael, Lemkin, and others played a crucial intellectual role and political role at various junctures. And before the concept of the Holocaust as a description of the Nazi murder of the Jews came into being, Raphael Lemkin gave the world the concept of genocide. In 1939, the concept of genocide did not yet exist. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, coined the term 1943 during a visit to the United States. Then the concept of genocide took on an intellectual and conceptual life of its own. Clearly, it was and is related to the destruction of European Jewry, later called the Holocaust, but today it also means more than that. The academic journal of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., for instance, is called Holocaust and Genocide Studies, indicating how these two concepts are joined at the hip today, but understood as two different things. And so it was from the beginning when Lemkin started to think about the concept in the mid-30s. But then he probably thought more about the Soviets and what they were doing in the Ukraine and in Belarus. The relationship between the concept of the Holocaust and the concept of genocide is also the relationship between a unique event and a more general crime. Hannah Arendt, for instance, did not use the term genocide until the 1960s. She described the tension between uniqueness and generality when she wrote about the Holocaust as a crime against humanity committed on the bodies of the Jewish people. And this she already did in 1945 in one of her first essays on these matters. Raphael Lemkin, who was 6 years older than Arendt, was born in 1900, some say he was born in 1901, in a small locality called Bezhkovne, which was part of Tsarist Russia when Lemkin was born and became part of Poland after World War I. His hometown was typical of places where Eastern European Jews lived. It was partitioned various times, partitioned again, changes in its territorial status constantly created new allegiances and minorities. And this was the context because these new allegiances and minorities and groups fighting over the same territory was done in an extremely violent way. I mean, these can be called bloodlands, if you want, which is Timothy Sznaider's term when he described the events of that particular region in Eastern Europe. This is the context in which the term genocide was born. Lemkin moved to Warsaw, studied law, and worked as a prosecutor there. He became an expert in international law. The term genocide first appeared in print in 1944 in a classic study by Lemkin that has now reached legendary proportions as the seminal and foundational text of genocide studies. Axis rule in occupied Europe, laws of occupation, analysis of government, proposals for redress. That's the title of the book published in Washington, D.C. by the Carnegie Foundation in 1944. When the book was published, the mass killings of Polish Jewry, including Lemkin's own family, had already taken place. The book was Lemkin's attempt to come to terms with the unprecedented crimes of the 20th century. In this respect, it was path-breaking, not unlike Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, published 7 years later, but conceived and planned at around the same time as Lemkin's book. Axis rule in occupied Europe is very different from Origins. Not a sweeping attempt to understand the 20th century, but a lawyer's almost desperate effort to come to terms with the Nazi genocide. Lemkin's book deals first with German techniques of occupation and reviews the laws and legislation of that occupation. The second part of the book provides an alphabetical list of the occupied countries, showing how the administration of these countries was subordinated to Nazi laws. The third part consists of another alphabetical list of countries and the wording of the laws of occupation. As a lawyer, Lemkin saw the struggle against genocide first and foremost as a legal problem. He believed that in defining genocide as a crime subject to prosecution under international law, he could find a mechanism for the international protection of national and ethnic minorities. The legal aspects of Nazi rule make up the bulk of his book, but this is not what it is remembered for, of course. The book endures because of one short chapter, Genocide, which took up only 16 of the book's 774 pages. In this chapter, Lemkin conceived, one might even say invented, a new way of looking at the unprecedented. He also coined this word, which is like composed of a Latin and a Greek root, and nobody in the beginning knew what it actually meant. He begins this chapter with the statement that new conceptions require new terms, and that by genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or ethnic group. That's Lemkin in 1944. From Lemkin's Eastern European Jewish perspective, it was clear that the world was divided up into nations and or ethnic groups. And I quote him, "The objectives of such a plan, i.e. genocide," he continues, "would be disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups." End of quote. Lemkin's historical scope is broader than the Nazi murder of the Jews, but he always comes back to the Nazis. He's considered primarily wars against populations rather than against sovereign states, and focuses on what would later be codified as crimes against humanity. In the second part of the book, Lemkin writes about the techniques of genocide, its political, social, cultural, economic, biological, physical, religious, and moral aspects. Under the cultural heading, he includes the destruction of libraries, archives, and museums. He singles out the burning of the Great Library of the Jewish Theological Seminar in Lublin, Poland, and even quotes a German article from the Frankfurter Zeitung of March 28, 1941, celebrating the burning of this great Talmudic library at that time. Lemkin always returns to the assault on Jews and Jewish culture, although, as I said, he tries always also to go beyond them. He was aware that he was confronting a new type of crime, writing that, and I quote him, "Techniques of genocide represent an elaborate, almost scientific system developed to an extent never achieved by any nation." End of quote. At the end of the chapter, Lemkin refers to the protection of minorities as the crux of his concept of genocide, as a problem not only of war but of peace. In his view, older systems for the legal protection of minorities could not deal with the crime of genocide, which he argues should be considered a universal crime. Lemkin's concept of genocide would become very significant in later debates regarding the Holocaust. For him, genocide was a heuristic concept that included the Holocaust, and his argument initiated a debate, still relevant today, I think, about whether the Holocaust was a unique event, a chapter of Jewish history alone, or whether the Nazi atrocities could be generalized and universalized, in which case the destruction of European Jewry becomes an example within the broader framework, whether called genocide, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity. Lemkin's position was that the destruction of European Jewry constituted a particular example of a broader general phenomenon. So you have now books, for instance, I just mentioned like one, Donald Blockson, The Final Solution, a genocide. And you have books where the Holocaust is sort of like integrated into genocide, and then you have these textbooks on genocide studies, introduction to genocide studies, and then you have Armenians, then you have the Ukrainians, the Jews, and the Holocaust, and then it goes on and on and on, and you have this kind of integration which sometimes takes Lemkin into account, sometimes it does not. The debate on the uniqueness of the Holocaust thus began, even before it was called like that, with that concept of genocide. Hannah Arendt, for instance, later built on this concept without explicitly relying on Lemkin's work. The historical episode of the Holocaust is therefore not just part of Jewish history. It also informs contemporary debates on cultural rights and their perceived challenges to universal human rights, emphasizing that universal human rights and cultural rights are not the same thing. We should also remember, today we sort of like talk about genocide and universal human rights and bring them together. In 1948, these were two competing chapters in the UN, and Raphael Lemkin, for instance, was very unhappy that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being proposed in the UN. He had to push forward the Genocide Convention. They were considered two different and even competing things. Today, they're probably more read together than different than they were in real time. The problem that Raphael Lemkin faced when he formulated his notion of genocide was how cultural pluralism and human diversity, coupled with respect for culture, can be combined with a commitment to norms and ideals that are binding for all humankind. As a lawyer, as I said, he tried to formulate this problem in legal terms. But the contextualization of Lemkin's ideas within Jewish history exemplifies the ways in which the notion of culture has become a contested concept in the discourse on rights. Cultural rights, like even the concept cultural genocide, and minority rights are not natural derivatives of human rights. They have been defined in different ways at different times. But both notions were part of an inner Jewish political debate on how to face the challenges of modernity. Both Lemkin and Arendt, and they are of course not alone in this, by far not, stand as exemplary actors in these debates in that their different answers were mustered within the same universe of discourse. Lemkin left Eastern Europe in the winter of 1939. A very good time to leave Eastern Europe when you were Jewish. In his unpublished autobiography, he tells the story of how he left for Riga in Latvia just in time. While Lemkin was waiting for a plane to Sweden, and he went first to Sweden, and from Sweden he came to the United States, he went to visit the most famous Jewish historian of that time, Shimon Dubnov, who lived in Riga at that particular time and was killed very shortly when the Riga ghetto was dissolved by the Nazis. And there I quote from his unpublished, unauthorized biography, and we don't even know if that conversation took place in that way, but it's written like this, and if it was not exactly like that, we sort of like can put it up in our heads in a very different way. And Lemkin said, there I turned the conversation to my plan to outlaw the destruction of peoples, he wrote. His reaction was vivid, he talked about, he wrote about Dubnov. And he quotes Dubnov, Lemkin. The basic value of your plan lies in the legal recognition of the act. Obviously, if killing one man is a crime, killing of entire races and people must be even a greater one. End of quote. Lemkin answers, killing an the individual is a domestic crime. Every nation deals with it through its courts and its own initiative, but murder of a whole people must be recognized as an international crime which should be condemned not just by one nation, but by the entire world. Nations will have to cooperate in punishing such criminals to prevent future mass murders. Should such a thing start again, the nations would have to act. Moreover, the offender will face judgment also by history. And Dubnow apparently answered, the most appalling part about this time of killing is that in the past it had ceased to be a crime when large numbers are involved, when all of them happen to belong to the same nationality or race or religion. These things must be discussed openly. Let nations take their choices whether they want to belong to civilized world community. I've always felt that history must sit in judgment. That was a discussion between Dubnow and Lemkin that took place in 1939. About 18 months later, Dubnow was killed by the Nazis in the Riga ghetto. Lemkin's account of this conversation may not be a verbatim transcription, but it is, in my opinion, emblematic of the link between Lemkin, who would coin the term genocide a few years later, and Dubnow, one of the most important historians of the Jewish people of the time, who not only affirmed the viability of the diaspora, but also championed the fight for the rights of the Jews as an autonomous people. Dubnow clearly rejected the assimilation of Jews within their host societies. He argued for what he called autonomism, under which people could be equal and different at the same time, and through which particular forms of membership were considered part of modern existence for minority groups, if you like, foreshadowing recent debates on multiculturalism. Dubnow developed his ideas on cultural autonomy around the same time that Lemkin came of age, a time when the problem of minorities had become a crucial one in Eastern and Central Europe. Of nationality, Dubnow wrote, and I quote him now, "And nationality in its overall development is a cultural historical collectivity whose members are united originally by common descent, language, territory, and the state, but who after some time reach a spiritual unity based upon a common cultural heritage, historical traditions, common spiritual and social ideals, and other typical characteristics of development." And of course, Dubnow later on wrote that actually having territory is like a lower stage in the development of a nation, because a nation then develops spiritually out of its need to have a territory. For Dubnow, as for many others at that time, nationalism and universalism were not mutually exclusive. In Dubnow's view, as he said, it is our duty to fight against the demand that Jews give up their national rights in exchange for rights as citizens. And in that, you know, he was, of course, in objection to what Jews were fighting for in the western parts of Europe, especially in Germany and in France. Dubnow rejected universal assimilation as a condition for citizenship and insisted on the unique national and cultural features of ethnic groups. His position anticipated conflicts not only between the notion, what was later called genocide, cultural and otherwise, and that of universal human rights, but also more poignantly, the European world in which both he and Lemkin lived, a world based on territorial sovereignty, whose bricks and mortar were ethnicity and minorities, of course. It was a world of population transfer and minority rights in a Europe that emerged out of the ruins of World War I and was created on paper by the Paris Treaties of 1918 and 1919. Let me just linger for a moment on this particular development, because I think it is extremely important for the emergence of today's international human rights regime, for the concept of genocide and all that. The Paris Peace Conference was crucial also for Jewish politics. News of the massacre of Jews in the hinterland between the future Poland and the future Ukraine began to filter into the conference and started to affect the deliberations of the participants. Ethnic minorities needed protection from ethnic nationalism. Jewish activists believed that this kind of protection could be internationally guaranteed through a new transnational politics. Clearly, many of the Jews as a transnational people favored a transnational legal system of protection. Zionism was not the only option for Jewish politics at that time. Sometimes they worked together with the autonomists, sometimes they did not, but it was clear that it was not the same thing. More than 7 million Jews lived in Eastern Europe at the time of the peace conference. Most of them did not survive what happened later. Jews who took part in the conference were fighting for legal recognition as Jews without a state. Its general secretary of the Comité de la Délégation Juive at that time, Leo Motzkin, a Russian-born Jew, published a collection of documents demanding exactly that. Motzkin wanted a new kind of new and revolutionary citizenship for Jews, a stateless citizenship, a citizenship that would cut across territorial nations and recognize Jews as citizens of Europe, even if they did not belong to a particular state. He and his fellow politicians insisted on the kind of personal and cultural autonomy that had existed in the former European empires, a theoretical notion that had been translated into political practice. He and his allies rejected the notion that Judaism was only a religion. They insisted on the status of Jews as a people, and on this basis, the forerunner of the Jewish World Congress, the World Jewish Congress, the Committee of the Jewish Delegations, demanded recognition as the bearer of collective rights and acknowledgments of the Jews as a national minority with rights of languages and culture. So Motzkin, for instance, demanded from the Allies a European passport for the Jews, that Jews could travel like throughout Europe, and he demanded a seat at the League of Nations for the Jews as a nation without a territory. Clearly, the Allies did not accept those demands. These efforts were dominated by anxiety over loss of protection and loss of culture on the part of Jewish participants who were in fact diplomats without a state and were working to develop a deterritorialized conception of rights. Although the League of Nations rejected most of their demands, it created an environment in which Jews could act politically as a collective. This status also functioned as a middle way between the options of assimilation or Zionism. It acknowledged a collective political Jewish identity that did not seek territorial sovereignty. Other minorities, Germans, Hungarians, Bulgarians, and Turks, for instance, but not only them, were represented at the peace conference in Paris by the spokesman of the defeated states, whereas Jews could find representation also among the victorious states. That was an interesting coalition also of Eastern European Jews and American Jews that were pushing there for national minority rights, and it was of course the French Jews and the German Jews who rejected that, and Arendt was sort of torn between these two positions, but that's a little bit of a different issue. But what it was all about was protection from which would later be called genocide or ethnic cleansing. Clearly the collapse of the European order had created a new category of people, the ethnic minority living within a nation-state's border. Thus the concept of minorities was born in Europe out of this ethnic and national situation. The minority treaties, like the other achievements of the Jewish delegation, reflected a cosmopolitan nationalism of the kind of Jewish historians like Dubnov and of course Salo Baron at Columbia University, who came to America, conceptualized, and that formed the background for Arendt's and Lemkin's own identities as Jews who were constantly struggling to translate this cosmopolitan nationalism into ways of acting beyond the borders of Jewish ethnicity. What made the Jewish delegates demand revolutionary was the recognition of statelessness as a new form of citizenship. For Jews, minority politics was a combination of particularism and cosmopolitanism, not a normative political theory, but something that emerged organically out of their life experience. It also foreshadowed questions of humanitarian interventionism or the lack thereof. One reason for the collapse of minority populations had no instrument of intervention. The principle of territorial sovereignty was still inviolable and always acted as hegemonic counterweight to minority rights. The peace conference served as a catalyst for renewed efforts to preserve the nation-state as an international principle. It also inaugurated at the same time the contemporary political trend in which international politics is informed by moral and legal principles, and in which, by extension, abuse of minority rights is subject to international treaties. This is true even though the system did not work, because these measures were designed to support the nation state, leaving the sanctity of national sovereignty untouched at that particular time. It took the catastrophe of the Holocaust, which targeted precisely that group which counted most on this kind of cosmopolitan protection, to change matters after 1945. Dubnow, Lemkin, Arendt, and other Jewish intellectuals were concerned with juggling this kind of particularism and universalism and collective and individual rights. Clearly, this balancing act took on more urgency after what is called the Holocaust, when Jewish intellectuals had to come to terms with what had happened. But the sources of the problems of this universalism and particularism go back further. They emerged out of the decline of empires and the rise of ethnic nation-states in their place. These Jewish activists were grappling with the questions of the degree of specificity of the Jewish problem and the type of solution it required. Should there be a solution for the Jewish people alone, or a more universal one? Many of them believed that ethnic groups, of course, had deep roots in culture. From their perspective, the issue was not merely a matter of giving the subaltern voice or engaging in a counter-memorial project, to use two fashionable terms for challenging dominant memory cultures today, but if you like, it's that kind of politics which gave sort of like a really practical voice to these really modern or postmodern ways of thinking, like subalternism and counter-memory and construction of ethnicities and all these things. What they did was a strategic essentialism before the concept became known in post-colonial literature. What this Jew, and I'm not saying that Jews invented post-colonialism, I'm not going that far, so, but what they were doing is exactly that. It was they were employing a kind of strategic essentialism before that concept became even known. What this Jewish minority politics tried to convey was that the universalist narrative obliterates the cosmopolitan potential of the Jewish experience, which straddles constantly the interstices of universal identification and particular attachments. Universalism was identified with assimilation, which was associated with giving up one's cultural identity. And this view goes, of course, against the grain of some of the current scholarship on those matters on ethnicity and nationalism, which is usually terrified by accusations of racism and essentialism and tends to maintain a firm grasp on a constructionist view of group belonging. So to make you, I mean, this is clear when you read the literature on ethnicity, race, and nationalism. It's all a big game of social construction. But in fact, this view simply means, I mean, like I said, that minorities are only construction, and they wouldn't have disagreed. I mean, they wouldn't have read the current literature, but they wouldn't have disagreed with the view that minorities are only construction. As Eastern Europeans socialized between the two wars, Lemkin, for instance, did not look on ethnic groups just as socially and culturally constructed. Although he was concerned about colonialism and the situation of blacks in the United States, Lemkin's thinking and political activities almost always remained centered on Europe. Though when you read in some of the critical literature, this is Eurocentrism. Yes, it's Eurocentrism. I mean, there are no ways to go around this. He was a Eurocentric, and he would never have rejected that kind of claim. And he may have shared this kind of Eurocentrism with Hannah Arendt, whose thinking was also informed by the European Jewish situation before the Holocaust, and then by the Holocaust, of course, itself. Lemkin, Arendt, and others took their fate and personal experience as European Jews as their starting point and broadened their stance to other cases in Europe. And sometimes their analysis went beyond Europe. I mean, not often, but sometimes their analysis went beyond Europe. Both Lemkin and Arendt sometimes connected their reading of modernity to questions of colonialism as well. And you may well know there's, of course, a whole reading on Lemkin and colonialism, books like Empire, Colony, Genocide, Conquest, Occupation and Subaltern Resistance in World History is just one example. rereading Lemkin, according to this, there's a book edited by King and then Stone, Hannah Arendt, and the Uses of History, Imperialism, Nation, Race, and Genocide. And these people go around and try to make a case that actually that Lemkin and Arendt were also concerned about the colonial question, and they were, but it always comes back to their European background. Minority rights were thought to be enacted to protect helpless minorities from strong majorities, and this you can of course generalize to places outside of Europe, and it was generally expected that genocide would be declared a crime by international law so as to protect the most vulnerable. Dubnow and Lemkin drew on their Eastern European experiences in reaching these conclusions. Their meeting took place on the eve of the destruction of European Jews, most of whom were Eastern European. They came from multi-ethnic communities that exploded into inter-ethnic violence. For people like Lemkin, for people like Dubnow, multi-ethnic communities is not some kind of multicultural paradise. It's the source of killing, it's the source of violence. If there was something that Poles and Ukrainians agreed on when they were stopping to kill each other, is that both wanted to kill the Jews. So it was always about the destruction of other ethnic groups. This is the background where all these things arise from. Lemkin came from that borderland of Central Eastern Europe, a region of shifting sovereignty where the presence of what came to be called minorities constantly undermined, and none of them perhaps fully realized the power of their premonitions. It was clear that the minority protection system worked out by the League of Nations had failed those it was supposed to protect. When Lemkin wrote about protection, he meant, as I said, national groups. And when he wrote about national groups, he meant, first of all, ethnic minorities. Thus, cultural and ethnic groups played a large part in Lemkin's thinking, and this is the source of what we call today genocide. And Lemkin paid close attention to the dangers, as I said, of cultural destructions. As I said, to Lemkin, genocide was by no means synonymous with the extermination of the Jews. In fact, Lemkin justified his efforts with references to genocidal activities that took place before and after the Holocaust. He was determined, like so many others, not to present the Holocaust, a term he did not use, of course, as an exclusive threat to European Jewry, as he made clear when he wrote, and I quote him, "The Nazi leaders had started very bluntly their intent to wipe out the Poles, the Russians, to destroy demographically and culturally the French element in Alsace-Lorraine, the Slovenians in Carniola and Carinthia. They almost achieved their goal in exterminating the Jews and Gypsies in Europe." End of quote. In 1948, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide then defined genocide in the broadest possible term as any of a number of acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And come to a conclusion, the concept of genocide, as we understand it today, grew first of all out of the Jewish Eastern European experience. But it never stopped there. Lemkin viewed the Jewish fate as a point of departure for his analysis of the fate of other ethnic and minority groups. He looked at the world through the lens of ethnic collectivities and was very much concerned with the struggle over minority rights in Europe between the world wars. This is the period that formed his worldview, in so much as the worldview of politically minded Jews that translated Jewish thinking into cosmopolitan terms. Lemkin and others were also convinced that the Jews as a transnational people were always in need of a transnational order for their protection. They would do better if their status was guaranteed by an international order. Clearly, this is a rather contested view today, because it had failed the Jews in a very dismal way. Lemkin tried to push the boundaries of his collective existence from particular premises to universal ones, combining maybe the monotheistic message of the Jews with the universal claims of the Enlightenment. In this sense, he is the personification of a cosmopolitan ideal with all its inherent contradictions. Thank you.
So I want to ask actually about the relationship between the really fascinating material on genocide and conceptions of genocide in your talk and her human rights, because you know, there have been several mentions here in various contexts of the way that human rights emerge out of this experience. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, because you can offer an alternative explanation of human rights and the relationship of human rights to genocide that people like Mark Mazow or Sam Moyn have articulated, which really sees it as an alternative to genocide as a model for the protections of people from abuses, right? That says that essentially the Genocide Convention would be seen as the last articulation of an older collective vision of minority protections, which is what you were sort of articulating here, whereas human rights moves to a more individuated, non-nationality-based protection of persons as individuals. And I mean, that seems to be the direction you were headed, but if you could explicate a little bit more about that. And also, just as an aside, what strikes me about that is that at least part of the turn to human rights, in a rejection really of this kind of minorities protection thing, has to do with the way that the minorities protection regime was discredited, because the people who exploited it most successfully were, of course, the Nazis, right, on behalf of German minorities in Eastern Europe. And so, you know, it's a little less saleable after World War II to say we're going to stick up for minorities when the minorities that you know, people were talking about most in the interwar period were, you know, Sudeten Germans, right, with all of the ill effects that had.
To your question, David, I mean, it's clear also, I mean, today genocide, human rights are seen as one package. And it's so fascinating to see that there were competing packages after the war. And Lemkin was furious, outraged by the efforts of passing a universal human rights declaration in the UN. He thought it's completely, it's destructive for minorities, it's destructive for the Jews because it individualizes people. And then the two conventions and declarations were like separated by 2 days in December of 1948. And you were exactly right. I mean, the Jews who were fighting for minority protection gave it up in 1945. And there's this wonderful example about the Institute for Jewish Affairs, which was based in New York, which was led by the two Lithuanian lawyers, Jacob and Nehemiah Robinson, who were minority rights activists. And they were also the ones who were sort of like thinking already in 1943 and 1944 about compensation and restitution of what happened to the Jews. And Jacob Robinson wrote a book in 1944, Were the Minority Treaties a Failure? And he came to the conclusion, yes, they were a complete failure. We cannot go down this road. And one of the reasons, of course, was exactly what you mentioned, the Sudetendeutschen. It's the Germans. It was the cause, basically. Minorities were the cause of World War II. And this is also why we have to give, I mean, Leo Motzkin, the one I mentioned, he, in 1927, founded, together with German minorities, the Congress of European Nationalities. This was this transnational organization where minorities were sitting together and having a debate about minority rights. And Motzkin was the leader of the Jewish delegation, and he was very much in touch with the leader of the German delegation who came from the Baltic states. They published a journal in German called Staat und Nation. And that journal is interesting to see, because when you look at it, it starts out as a journal which could be identified in today's language with multiculturalism. Wonderful, all these minorities working together, separate but equal, it's great, and all that. And all of a sudden, you know, the German Nazis from Czechoslovakia are taking over the German, are taking over the Congress. And they're talking about us and disassimilation and basically Motzkin in 1933, a couple of months before he died, said, if these German Nazis are taking over the Congress of European nationalities, I'm taking out the Jewish delegation from this Congress. And this is exactly what happened in 1933. And that was the end of the Congress of European minorities, and it was the end of basically Jewish minority politics then. And all these people then sort of like gave it up and said, and came to the conclusion, we have now to work bipolar. On the one hand, we're working for a universalized, individualized conception of human rights, not minority rights anymore, and we support the state of Israel. And we become Zionists at the same time. These are the two solutions. The Jews have their own state, and if they don't have their own states, they're going to be protected by this individualized notion of human rights. Lemkin was outraged. I've seen this correspondence between him and Jacob Robinson. It's like, well, what are you doing? You're betraying the Jewish cause. You're sort of like you're supporting this human rights thing. You know, you should not support the human rights thing. You should support the Genocide Convention. It's a completely different thing. And Jacob Robinson wrote him back and said, you know, Raphael, you have to understand we live in a different world now. And Lemkin was sort of, he was outraged. He was so angry and believed that this human rights thing is going to completely destroy his efforts for genocide protection, and didn't think that the two can sort of like merge into this international sort of like more international legal and moral problem that they are today. Sort of like they're completely joined together today. But back then it was like a big internal fight. Right? Fascinating stuff. And clearly the Soviet situation was crucial for the beginning of Lemkin's thinking. I mean, this is when when he was working as a young lawyer in Warsaw, he knew about what was going on in Ukraine. He knew what was going on in Ukraine, and in the 1930s, before World War II. So he was clearly aware of that, as many intellectuals in Poland at that particular time were aware of what was going on in Ukraine, and it definitely informed much of his thinking. Now, clearly, also many intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals at that time, believed that the minority politics in the Soviet Union was one of the most progressive minority politics. But it all started to change in the 1930s, and for the people of the World Jewish Congress, when they came to Geneva in 1936, it was clear that Stalinism was already part of the fight against against the Jews in the Soviet Union. This is when the people at the World Jewish Congress started to use the first time the concept of totalitarianism, which then later in the 50s became such a defining concept in describing Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So it was already part of the Jewish vocabulary during the World Jewish Congress in 1936. And whatever was left of Jewish minority politics and of Jewish autonomism after 1945, in 1952, nothing was left of it in the Soviet Union. And I think the last act was the organized killings of the Yiddish writers and poets in 1952, where they were all arrested at the same time and executed in 1952. And basically, Yiddish writing, Yiddish scholarship, Yiddish poetry and literature from 1952 on did not exist anymore, and the Jews became part of the persecuted minorities.
Stalin did that? Stalin did that?
Yes. There was the night of the Yiddish poets. It's called not a program. It's just like the execution of the leading Jewish Yiddish writers at that particular time. So clearly, then when Lemkin also came to America and he started to push his genocide convention, part of his political strategy was, because we were at the beginning of the Cold War, was also to emphasize to his political audience the crimes of the Soviet Union and to see them in conjunction with the crimes of Nazi Germany, which is even more surprising than if you think that Lemkin and Arendt, that there's no connection between them. I mean, they probably live like 10 minutes away from each other on the Upper West Side in Manhattan around the same time, but we don't know of any kind of content they have. The only place they're together now are in textbooks on genocide. If you have a little excerpt of Origins of Totalitarianism, then you have the excerpt of Lemkin. They're together, but in real time, when they were sort of like coming from those different directions, which had to do probably, I assume, that it had to do with personal things, that Lemkin was connected to the Institute of Jewish Affairs, which was headed by Jacob Robinson, and Jacob Robinson and Hannah Arendt had a very problematic relationship. They really, really resented each other for all kinds of reasons.
I find myself very sympathetic to the critique of Sznaider Kukat's Sznaider Kukat's was a political theorist at LSE, who says that Lemkin must have thought that groups have value in themselves as such, apart from how they contribute to the welfare and flourishing of individuals. And that can't be right, because very often groups do not contribute to the welfare or value and flourishing of individuals. Some groups do, some groups don't, very decidedly. And so groups themselves can't be worth protecting as such, and yet that seems to be one of the basis of the culture, ethnicity, nationality, whatever. And so it just can't be right that preserving groups as such is an inherently valuable thing for international law to do. And I've never been able to find or come up with a convincing response to that. The best answer I can give is one that probably has an historical explanation. When we proposed this to you, possibly you said that the matter of the point in time, historically, when he was coming of age in interwar Europe, right in the aftermath of the First World War, is the breakup of all these multinational, multi-ethnic empires. Mm-hmm. And for 20 years after the First World War, everyone thought the solution to inter-ethnic international conflict was a separate state for each nation. Mm-hmm. And now we see that not as the solution, but the problem, because that requires ethnic cleansing, or leads to, almost entails ethnic cleansing. But at the time when he was thinking, and coming up with the notion of group protection as something to launch should value, this was the context, and so maybe it made sense.
Mark, yes, I mean, this was the fight in 1948 between universalists and particularists, and Lemkin was, you know, what can be called in sociology a groupist. In that sense, I think Brubaker calls that groupism, that kind of thinking, where you take the group as an essence. And but this was exactly. I mean, he couldn't. I don't think that someone from his background could look at the world in different terms. I mean, this is so existentially ingrained in the way from where he came from, and the way he was living his life, that also that meeting that I found in this autobiography, which I really have no idea. It cannot be corroborated in a legal sense, between him and Dubnov is such a wonderful document, because Dubnov really comes also from exactly that kind of thinking, you know, autonomy and group rights and cultural rights. But you can only argue that if you believe in the essence of groups, and this is, of course, I mean, liberals reject that and have a very grounded critique of this kind of thinking, and sort of like you have to intellectually make a decision where you locate yourself in this debate somehow. But this is where it comes from. No doubt about it. This is where the Genocide Convention comes from. I mean, this is clear.
Kukat's would say it's also where genocide itself comes.
And it's clear that the mechanism which tries to protect from exactly that. Sort of when Lemkin was arguing, you know, groups are under attack. So we need a group rights mechanism to protect us. And this was exactly the debate Jews had in Paris in 1819. the French Jews, the British Jews, and the German Jews said, what's going to protect us is not group rights, but equality. And the others said, what's going to protect us is not equality, but the recognition of difference. In the end, neither that nor the other did protect us.
I thought that he had the Nuremberg trial.
Yes, I'm also fascinated by this tension between the protection of individual rights and group rights that was central to the debates you presented us with. If I understand this talk and also your other writings correctly, your argument is in part that the celebration of individual rights was partly born out of the failure of the protection of group rights. And this failure was partly in response to the principle of national sovereignty that was still strong and unchallenged in the post-World War I era. Of course, that principle is not as challenged anymore today. There are a number of legitimate ways in which the international community can get involved in the internal affairs of a country. So should we, in this situation, not have to rethink this balance between group rights and individual rights and say that in line with the current situation of legitimate intervention in national affairs by the international community, group rights should have a place again. And I think that's an argument that is made today by many who challenge the notion of individual focused human rights as a Western tradition that overrules and overrides and sometimes disrespects very different philosophical traditions in other parts of the world.
No, but I think that's an excellent point. Group rights is part of the Western tradition as well. If you see Eastern Europe as part of the Western tradition, or I mean, Western East for me is always Western Europe and Eastern Europe. I mean, for most others, the distinction between West and East is a little bit better. But I'm completely Euro-centered. This is my own bias. But in many ways, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think if you can have the possibility of de-essentializing groups and see it as what I think. I mean, I read this when I was a student. I don't remember who wrote it, about this strategic essentialism. Someone remember who invented that term? I don't. Kind of like, but Stuart Hall got it. Stuart Hall, and this kind of strategic essentialism, sort of like where you see yourself as where you see your essentialism as constructed on the one hand, but you use it in order to fight, to make your fights. I mean, this is what feminism has done already for a long time, and I'm sure that ethnic groups can do it in a similar way. It's not very different.
You had a question?
And we had that discussion yesterday. If you allowed for feminism as a political way of dealing with the world, you can also allow, for ethnic groups to do something very similar.
It's interesting to note that beginning tension in these international instruments between universalism and particularism. I guess coming with decolonization, the African case, when African regional mechanisms were put together for human rights, it's the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It's sort of the name, and I think there's a bit of that, maybe pushback isn't the right word, but a bit of pushback against the very individualistic notion where you have countries that were formed on very artificial, arbitrary boundaries in terms of where ethnic groups and ethno-nationalisms lay. Kind of comment, I guess, on the question.
No, I think maybe just to sum this up, and also, I mean, in the end, when Arendt was writing her thing, she wrote this wonderful book called On Revolutions, where she compared the French to the American Revolution. And she said the French Revolution was really a failure because it could not deal with difference and otherness in the kind of French republicanism. And the only solution to these kind of dilemmas between individualism and the kind of soft groupism is the American notion of liberty. And this is how she basically sort of like wrote her homage to this country and was like eternally grateful that she received citizenship here and thought this is the kind of the American way of pluralistic existence is exactly the kind of solution for these kind of dilemmas. So that's
Professor Sznaider, thank you for getting us off to a very good start.